The god's wood held its breath beneath the weight of new snow. Winterfell's walls had drunk their fill of storms through 1,000 years. Every stone wore a memory of wind and wolves, and the iron taste of cold. At first light the snow settled without sound, hushing the yard and swallowing the prince of the night watch. The world smelled of pine and old earth. A hooded figure moved past the heart tree, slow as someone listening to more than the creak of boughs. Jon pressed a gloved palm to the weirwood's bark, his skin warning him of the cold even through leather. The face in the tree stared with red eyes over his shoulder, and it was easy to imagine that the sap was blood, and the mouth could breathe if it wished. The quiet here was a different quiet than the wall's high winds, a depth that wrapped a man and made him smaller, not harder. Ghost padded around the roots in a pale circle, his fur taking the color of snow until only his eyes gave him away. A raven clattered above where the branches kept their own counsel. Jon looked up, half expecting it to carry a message. Ragged parchment. Another summons, another coil of duty knotted around his throat, but no wire flashed. The bird fluffed, shook itself, and peered with more suspicion than any lord had ever learned at court. Ghost's ears twitched. He looked toward the covered passage that led back into Winterfell and whined softly. "I know," Jon said. His breath made a small cloud. "You feel it too." He had delayed as long as he could without calling it weakness. Counsel had been taken with Sansa the night before, until the last candle burned itself out and bled tallow over the lip of its dish. With Arya in the shadows, who never begged a seat at any table, and yet had always sat where she pleased. With the captains of the winter town, who had only ever wanted to know if they would be fed, and if their children would see spring. He had taken counsel with the quiet memory of his father beneath the crypt, and with Sam's parchment words from Old Town, and with a name he had never asked for, given him by a dead man in a tower of sunlight and blood. The summons lay in his doublet, next his heart where it might burn, if it had a spark in it. The wax had been pale gold, pressed with a stag and a wheel, and the sword and cup of the reach, and 3 towers for the mander, and a falcon for the veil. Other seals had been added upon receipt by those who wished to be seen as part of the thing, so that the letter looked like a horde of little round shields, around too few words. Lords declarant. They called themselves in their own voices, and in the whispers of their rivals. In truth, they were what had been left when winter rode down kings, as if they were boys at a tilting yard. Those with the harvest to feed an army, the ships to bring grain if the roads were cut, the steel to pretend at law when the law hung by threads. The summons called for a great council, not a parley nor a progress nor a marriage feast, but a summoning of all who could claim with a straight face to speak for a multitude. It ordered no man. It required, and that was a different thing to a Northman and to a man who had learned command. Sansa had said with a stillness that reminded him of their mother in the sense that it reminded him he had not known her, that the letter would have been written whether he lived in Winterfell or lay beyond the wall. "It is not about us," she had told him. "It is about what they fear. They fear they will be made to kneel to any one sword. They fear each other more than they fear any king. That fear is cumbersome to carry alone, so they seek a circle. And in the circle, someone always measures the shadows," Arya had said. She had been cleaning the edge of a slender blade, the cloth moving like a heartbeat, and cuts them shorter. Jon had turned the parchment until the seals winked like coins. He had thought of Brienne bringing word from the Riverlands, of Edmure's stolid voice, of Lord Royce, whose face held as many creases as the veil had seasons. He had thought of Gendry Baratheon, all shoulders and squint, hammer on an anvil, who had been told he was a lord, and had believed it only because work and blows had taught him to believe in the proof of his own hands. He had thought of Arianne of Dorne, fire under silk, of Yara Greyjoy frowning at the taste of propriety. He had thought of Tyrion Lannister, who had never believed in circles unless he could plant a chair at their center. The letter had not said where the council would meet, not in the first line. It had waited, as if to teach a lesson about patience, before choosing the dragon pit, as if the stones remembered what it meant to put dragons inside a ruin and ask them not to mind the bars. It had said that all were to come with honor guards and no more, that hostages would be taken only of those who had made a habit of hostage-taking, that the law would be spoken by a man in green and white chosen by the Citadel, and a woman in gray chosen by the Citadel, and a woman in gray chosen by the faith, and a hard-eyed Bravosi chosen by a consortium of men who counted money for a living. It had said 100 things without saying the one that mattered. Who should sit a throne that had melted under dragon fire and then been hammered back into shape by men who were afraid of emptiness? A wind sighed through the red leaves, stirring the snow where it had settled on the heart tree's crown. Jon could smell the hot wool and animals' breath of the stables even through the hem of the godswood, the iron tang of the smithy waking. He thought of the forges, of men and women and children who had spent the last days trimming and hemming the new banners that had been commissioned quietly and in defiance of all superstition. He had not wanted them, not with his own name stitched where the thread felt too much like a chain, but Sansa had insisted. A realm is a thing you can hold in your hands, she had said, not because it is simple, because it is cloth and wood and bread and stone, and all that is heavy. Symbols carry weight when men are tired. So the seamstresses had drawn, and pricked their fingers, and argued, and settled. A dire wolf, silver gray as hoarfrost, gaunt and swift, ran along a ribbon of red, so dark it almost red as shadow. From behind it, as if shadow could burn, rose a three-headed dragon that had been rendered in black, and a thread so glossed it looked wet, until firelight took it, and then it was molten cherry beneath cinders. The wolf and the dragon were turned the same way, their mouths open, their movement forward. What name the thing would someday be given by those who sold it in the market stalls, and by boys who copied it in charcoal on walls, he could not know. It was meant to be simple, the North and the blood of Valyria, together, not eating one another, not yoked one under the other, but running the same road. His hand on the weirwood, Jon breathed in and tried to breathe out some part of the knot inside his ribs. He had learned once that a man might be two things at once and never be at peace with either. That there could be a boy called Snow in a good man's house who might be sent to die for a larger name. That there could be a man called Targaryen who could not stand the taste of his mouth when he said it aloud. Duty narrowed him. Love tried to widen him. Somewhere between those two was a road only wolves could scent. Footsteps in the snow behind him did not trouble Ghost. Jon didn't turn. He had never been able to hide from Sansa, even when he had been sure he could hide from everyone else. You always come to him when you do not want to speak. Her voice was soft but carried like light. He knows what I cannot say, Jon answered. Or he does not have to ask me to say it. Sansa came to stand at his side, looking not at the tree, but at the snow. The fur around her throat was the color of a fox running at dusk. She had woven a gray ribbon into her hair, and it made him think of their mother again, in a way that he knew was a feeling, more than a fact. There are people, she said, out there under the bridge, lining up to see what bread will give them today. There are others who are not in line because pride makes them hungrier than hunger. There is a woman who kept 3 turnips buried under the floorboards and only dug them up on feast days. And now the floorboards are broken because boys with empty hands pulled them up hoping to find a festival. These are the things you should imagine when you imagine a council, Jon Dadal. Not gold seals and words written in ink. The first duty is to mouths. If the council breaks into knives, it will be the mouths that feel the first cut. 9? I remember, Jon said. Little Sam's cry in the cold, the thin shoulders of boys who had put on black, and found out then how sharp the edge of the world could be. I am thinking of mouths. And of names, Sansa said, not smiling, but not cruel. Of truths. We do not choose the truths, but we choose how loudly to speak them. If you wish to keep the North's quiet dignity, you must go south and choose a place to stand and speak softly. Now, I never wanted. Sansa's gloved hand moved, barely touching his sleeve. You never wanted to be dead either, she said gently. Then you were, and then you weren't. You never wanted to be a man who carried a secret. He had never been granted the courtesy to refuse. You are still that man. Want has very little to do with what the world asks of us. I have learned that, and I hate it. And it keeps me warmer than furs some nights. Snow fell into her hair, A single flake found the corner of her eye and melted, and for an instant, it looked like a tear she had not known she gave. Ghost came forward and pressed his head against her hip. Sansa's hand slid into that white coat. "Arya will go with us," she said. "She'll complain about the walls. Brienne will go. She says it will add to some imaginary list she keeps of the things a knight never expects and should be prepared for. We'll take Royce and young Lord Serwyn, Wyman's boy, and the Mormont girl who glowers like she's already a mourning statue raised for herself. I will ask Mage to mind the winter town. I suppose there is no asking. I will simply tell her, and she will do it, and then scold me because she cannot scold the world. And now..." Jon closed his eyes. "Letter. Banners. Names." He had ridden south so many times in his thoughts that it seemed as useless to resist the real road as it would be to forbid the sun to kneel in winter before the horizon. "Sam wrote," he said, and heard the way his voice wished to leave him. "From Old Town. He has the copy of the Septon's record, the one you found. He says there was a second register written by a man who dealt in the counting of witnesses and the tallying of dowers. He thinks it is the sort of small notice respectable men write when they wish to pretend that an inconvenient truth is neat." "Truth is never neat," Sansa said matter of fact. "We will take Howland Reed with us." Jon's eyes opened. "He has not left the Neck Inn." "He will leave for Lyanna Stark," Sansa said, with the certainty of stone. "He will leave for Ned Stark. He will leave for a boy he saw born in a tower because he could not help himself from keeping promises to men he loved. I sent a raven at dawn yesterday. If we ride south in 3 days, we will meet him at Moat Cailin. If we do not, he will find his way here and tell us we should have waited." He should have smiled. He could not. Sansa did not ask him for the letter. She did not ask him to repeat the words about tokens and terms and honor guards. She did not say king. The word hovered around them sometimes like breath in cold air, visible and dangerous to indulge. "You will tell the Weirwood goodbye," she said instead, in a voice that was very nearly his sister's again, and not a lady's. "And then you will tell the stable that we ride. And then you will eat soup with me as if we were 10 years old and in trouble. And if you do not smile, I will have Arya throw something at you." He did laugh then, a scrape of sound that hurt him and soothed something else. "I'll bring Ghost," he said. "You always do." By midday the yard rang with the ordinary miracles of men and women doing work that needed doing. Oxen were led to the great sleds to carry casks of oats and salted meat. Mules had their hooves examined with solemn curiosity by a boy who would one day be able to judge a horse's future by the shape of a frog. Osha scolded and laughed, and scolded again as children darted under elbows to see the pageant. A thin stew of onions and bones and barley bubbled in a row of kettles, the heat of them turning the air damp. Bowls passed from hand to hand with mittened palms pressed to their sides for warmth. A woman bent low in a doorway to mend the strap of a snowshoe, and sang under her breath in a voice that vanished if you tried to listen too hard. Arya appeared the way a cat appears, there all at once with a look in her eyes that told you she had been there for some time. She wore riding leathers patched until the patches outnumbered the original cloth, and her hair was bound back with a strip of darker gray. Needle's hilt poked over her shoulder. "Brienne says it's unseemly to draw weapons in the hall," she said without preamble. "So, I will keep this for unseemly places. Everything south of the neck is unseemly," Jon said. And Arya grinned. "Even their milk curdles differently," she said. "They pretend it's cheese and then talk about it like wine." He could feel the way she measured him, the way a fighter measures the weight and balance of a blade. Arya's care was never the sort that asked you to perform your grief. It simply walked with you as far as you needed, and then stood with its back to you at the door. She bumped her shoulder against his, an old joke, and disappeared again without a farewell. Because when you were already leaving, goodbye was for the benefit of those who stayed. That night, in the great hall, Wyman Manderley's grandson read a list of stores with the solemnity of a maester intoning a prayer. Lyanna Mormont declared that if the council became a fight, she would count the teeth she knocked loose herself, and keep them as trophies. Gilly coaxed a laugh out of a child who had forgotten there was such a thing as merry noise. Sansa presided with a face that turned to each speaker like a lamp to a road. When the dinner had thinned to the diehards and the servants with nowhere else warm to sit, Jon pushed back his bench and made for the crypts. He took a lantern and a skin of wine. He took no guard. The crypt was a place where men kept watch over their dead, and where the dead kept watch over their living, and where neither felt in especial danger from the other. Ghost slipped along at his heel, as quiet among stone men as he was among snow. The smell of the crypt was dust and old bone, beeswax and wool oil, damp that had found a home and made itself decent. Ned Stark's likeness sat with a sword across stone knees. Lyanna's statue held her flowers. The iron of those petals had rusted dark as dried blood, where the damp had held its breath in winters that would never be counted. A single candle burned at her feet. Someone had been here. Someone always had been. Jon set the lantern down and drew the cloak closer around his shoulders. Suddenly colder here than above. "Father," he said without ceremony, "because if it were true, the words were a prayer, and if it were false, the words were still a prayer to the man who had been a father. I'm going south. I would ask you what to do if I thought you would tell me to do something different than what I'm going to do." He smiled at the stone mouth, and the echo made his face feel strange. "You always would have told me to do my duty. You would have told me to be honest. You would have told me to keep my word." He turned his head to Lyanna's face, which had been cast by hands that had guessed more than known. "And you," he said quietly, "gave me a different name and a different duty and a different word to keep. I'm not angry with you." He closed his eyes. I used to be. Now I'm only tired, and tired men get angry easily, and I don't want to be that. I want to be clear. I have a chance to do something that will stop good men from killing each other because of names I didn't choose. If they ask me to sit a chair made of swords, I will only do it if it means fewer boys will ever have to hold a dying friend. I'll only do it if it means the next winter will be kinder. I don't know if a man can promise such things, but I know what it feels like to fail to keep men alive. Mendasatis. Stone eyes looked past him. The candle, tugged by a draft, guttered. Shadows leapt. He poured a little wine on the floor and drank some himself, and did not know if ghosts approved of wine. They set out 2 days before the third. Sansa had been right about Howland Reed. The crannogmen came up out of the marshland as if the mud had given birth to them, and Howland rode a shaggy horse that might once have been a deer if you believed men who wanted to decorate stories. He had hair like moss, and a face the wind had tugged at for a long time, and eyes like water in a still pool. He bowed to Sansa and embraced Jon without asking permission, the way old men who had earned their scars did. He was not a talker until the fire was low and sleep sat heavy on eyelids. Then he told stories of the crossing of the neck and of the eye that sees through birds, and of a tower where a lavender scent had clung to the stones. Even as the sunlight dried blood in a shape a hand could not finish cleaning. Jon listened. He listened as he had listened at the wall, when old men described how men failed each other, and did not mean to, and how to recognize the kind of failure that would get other men killed. He listened to Howland tell him that truth was not a sword, but a rope. "It will hold you if you hang by it," the crannogman said, "and it will burn your hands if you try to climb it too fast." They crossed the causeway with slow care because carts laden with barrels could not be hurried, and because reed beds swallowed wheels. The sky there was a pale sheet, sometimes very near, sometimes opening to a vault so vast Jon began to feel the itch between his shoulders that he had felt on the wall when the world opened and a man could fall upwards into the night. The children of the neck brought them lily pads and frogs, as if the north were made of greater wonders than walls of ice, and men who came back from death. Arya taught a boy how to flick a pebble hard and fast with a forefinger and thumb, and then scolded him when he tried to do it to a sleeping soldier. The boy laughed, then hiccuped, then laughed more. Moat Cailin rose out of bog and mist in a way that made it look as if giants had once tried to dam a river with handfuls of castles, and then lost interest. What was left was a memory of a fortress. They slept in a tower with a roof that had fallen in, and then been mended with timber and tar and straw, and the prayers of men who had never learned to trust masonry over thatch. In the morning, the frost lay in the framework of the old murderer reeds like lace. They turned south. The land changed. The air softened around the edges. Men's speech lost consonants, as if it were warming its mouth on its own sound. They passed farmsteads where girls with thick wrists carried buckets yoked across their shoulders, and where boys ran alongside the road with sticks, pretending to be spears until a mother called them back by their full names, in a tone that told John more about law than any scroll. They ate cheese with a rind-like bark and bread that tasted of molasses, where someone had sweetened the dough to stretch the flour. At a market where the stones of the square were worn by generations of feet, a man with a scar across his scalp tried to sell John a ring he swore had belonged to Beeler Breakspear. John paid him enough to feed his children without taking the ring because he knew the weight a lie carried, when a man told it because he needed it. Letters ran ahead and behind them. A rider in pale green arrived with an expression that was half self-importance and half terror, and presented Sansa with a statement from the Reach about grains and terms, and a mention of certain fishing rights, as if men and boats and nets could be set to ink and be made to behave. Another rider came from the Vale with a note in Royce's hand that contained none of the flourish and half the words of the Reached letter, and told them exactly what numbers of men were already camped within sight of the dragon pit, and exactly who disagreed with which cousin and why. A third rider in yellow and orange arrived with a box that held dates stuffed with something sweet and the smell of cinnamon. A braid of those colors wound through the messenger's hair. Sansa laughed to see such decadence in winter, and cut the dates into fourths, so that many mouths could have a taste. Howland Reed ate his piece with grave consideration, as if he were memorizing the way the sugar melted, so he could carry it back to the neck and tail. They reached the Trident, where the water went wide and brown and slow, and the ghost of a boy barely born stared up from the current, under a sky where banners had once torn, and men had once sung on their way to die, as if the song were the fight. John looked at the water and thought of his father dying, and of his father not dying, and of the way choice and chance turned their cloaks inside out and pretended to be one another. He thought of a prince with a harp. He thought of a girl with a crown of winter flowers wilting in a tower too hot for memory to keep perfectly cool. On the third day past the Trident, the smell of lime and char reached them even before the city's outline rose. The smell of stone after it has learned what fire can do to it. King's Landing had been burned and rebuilt more times than a sane city could survive. A sane city was a contradiction. The dragon pit sat like a wounded thing above the city, a silhouette with ribs. Snow fell there too. It looked wrong against the old blackened stone, as if winter had been invited to a funeral and had not known what to wear. The red keep glowed in the distance, with a different breath than the skies. Braziers made their own stars. Between those two hung the city with its warehouses and whores and kings and cats, pretending at order the way a market pretends at sacred ground, when the first coin of day changes hands and the last coin buys a crust at dusk. They were met at the gate of the gods by a woman in gray with a face like an unsheathed blade, and a man in green and white, who had already ink-stained 3 fingers through the glove, and a bravosi, with a hat that would have been foolish on anyone who had not worn it with such bleak authority. The woman was called Maribald's daughter, because she had refused to give a family name to the faith when they had asked to write one. The man from the Citadel said he was Maester Lothar, and then added a cluster of letters that meant he had studied law until his teeth had worn down. The bravosi said he had a name too, but that for the purposes of this meeting and any meeting henceforth, he expected to be addressed only as Factor. He said it without pride. It was not humility either. It was a man's acceptance that his work was a blade to be kept clean of personal stain. They offered terms, and they offered shelter, and they offered to feign neutrality. Sansa took what she needed and gave back gratitude that cost less than coin. Brienne had ridden up along the flank of the column and wore a new cloak that bore the device of a blue-green field with a many-pointed star, a concession to both the lady she had sworn to and some older vow within herself. Arya went sideways with the horses until she could see up into the city on the hill, and then forward again with half a smile. Howland Reed looked as if he were watching a lake for a fish that absolutely existed and would break the surface if a man could manage not to blink for days. Davos met them on the broad stair below the remains of the dragon pit, his face more lined, his smile more necessary. His cloak still bore the onion boat, because he did not see the need to polish the truth. He hugged Jon without asking and stiffly, because they were men, and they had only ever known each other through trouble. "I won't insult you by saying you shouldn't have come," he said. "I would have gone north and dragged you myself, and I'm too old to ride that much." Jon snorted. "How many are here?" "Enough," Davos said, and his face said too many. The Reach came with their cousins and their cousins' cooks. The Riverlands arrived in pieces and then argued about how to sew themselves back together without showing the seams. Dorne came like a knife that had never been sheathed and made everyone nervous just by standing still. The Vale could conquer half the world if they ever decided to follow a man without asking him to prove he'd never take a false step. The Stormlands look like blacksmiths and punch like millers. The Ironborn smell like the sea and like the idea of salt more than the real thing. He scratched at the jaw under his beard. And the Lannisters came too, in the manner of Lannisters. The gold didn't come with them. Or if it did, it came dressed as good intentions. "Tyrion?" Jon asked. Davos said. "And his mouth. And his mind. He's been laying planks others can cross without getting their boots wet and telling them he won't be beholden if they happen not to slip. He held a table out to you that you would not take when you would not take any tables. He's holding one out to you now, and he means it. He'd have you king because he'd have one man to argue with rather than 20 circles to go around and around and around and until the world is too dizzy to do anything." They slept that night in a long house that had once been used to stable messenger hawks. Straw had been swept out and rushes laid down and a barrel of wine rolled into the corner, and a pot of something aromatic kept warm on coals. Jon lay under a blanket and stared at beams that had seen more secrets than the walls of any council chamber. He dreamed no dragons and no wolves. He dreamed of men carrying tables up a hill, and of women drawing lines on the tables and of children dancing along the lines as if they were roads as yet unconquered by war. The great council convened in the dragon pit the next morning at a reasonable hour, not because reason held sway, but because men could not resist trying to drag reason into witness for their cause. The snow fell, thin and stubborn, into the hollow of the old dome, where dragons had once been chained by men who had been afraid of the day dragons, might decide to visit men's houses uninvited. Benches had been laid in ranks and aisles cut through them. At the pit's broken mouth a high dais had been built, not from iron masquerading as rock, but from rock, honestly cut, and the planks that joined it together were planed smooth by men who might also make cradles. Above the dais were hung banners. The rose and the sun and spear, the trout, the moon and falcon, the kraken, the lion, the stag. And there, at Sansa's insistence, and because the men hanging the cloth had shrugged and said it made as much sense as anything else under winter, the direwolf running before the three-headed dragon. Murmur went up at that, the movement of many throats. It was not a shout. Shout would come later if food was late or if pride was starved. It was the sound of men measuring. Maribald's daughter spoke first. Her voice would have been beautiful if it had cared whether it was. "We are gathered," she said, "because the faith has decided to prefer peace to pride, because the citadel has chosen to count heads rather than graves, because the men who count coin have determined that the flow of grain and gold will always be thinner under a crown that sits upon a skull. We are gathered because winter has taught us that our numbers are smaller than our illusions. We will speak as if truth can be spoken. We will hear as if words can be heard. If a man draws steel, he will be taken out, and his name will be written in a book named Fool, and he will not be the first entry." Menderwanha. The factor bowed minutely to the crowd as if to a theater audience. Maester Lothar blinked rapidly and rustled a parchment that had more empty space than words on it. Tyrion Lannister stood at the aisle head like a man about to wager on a horse he had bred, and shot himself, and then had to sell, and now hoped to see win under another's colors to prove he had been right. Sansa sat with her hands folded, and her knuckles were pale, and her face composed, and only a very knowing eye would have seen the places where anyone else's fear would protrude. Arya had vanished the way a shade vanishes when light cannot make up its mind. Brienne stood at Sansa's shoulder like a door someone had carved out of a mountain. Howland Reed looked like a patch of marsh grown thoughtful. Names were called, and men spoke them. The Riverlands put forward Edmure Tully with a clear heart and a muddle of qualifications. Edmure rose and opened his mouth and told a story about how he had once made a mistake with a fishhook and learned from it, and then sat down when he saw Sansa's eyes and seemed grateful to have not floundered until the mud covered his nose. The veil suggested that precedent mattered and that blood should be counted, but that wisdom should be counted more. And then everyone began to argue about whether wisdom belonged to any man who said he had it. The Reach conducted a gentle war on the room, with polite phrasing and grammar, both rigid and elegant, and underneath the pansies of their speech was steel. Dorne said nothing for a long while, and then said one thing that made silence a sharper thing to hear. When the Citadel declared that proof had been brought regarding the legitimacy of a marriage once called unlawful, because men had preferred love to follow a story that suited their fear. Jon stood. It should have been the world that rose around him. It felt like something inside him stood while the rest remained seated, and was therefore left behind. Sam came forward, ungainly and brave. He put scrolls on a table like a man laying out bread and meat, and he looked at the man called Factor until the Braavosi nodded out of respect that he tried to hide. Howland Reed stepped beside him without flourish. Others had their proofs of this or that, of grain promised to this neighbor or troops pledged to that. None had a proof a man could scorn without looking petty and thin. Here was a Septon's mark. Here were namings in cramped hands written in light that no longer fell on the paper. Here were witnesses. A Crannog man who did not travel and did. A maester who had forgotten how to be afraid of being mocked. A king's son whose eyes did not ask for belief, and so somehow got it. Tyrion's voice sailed into the chill air. "We are all of us tired of war," he said mildly. "We are perhaps less tired of the stories we tell ourselves about why we fought. I am interested in something unfashionable. Arithmetic. I am interested in roads that can be traveled without having to stop at every mile to argue about the owner of the stones. There is in this man," he gestured at Jon without looking away from the crowd, "the blood of two houses that have burned this world down and then rebuilt it twice over, one with swords and the other with silence. I propose, because it is time for someone to be plain, that we crown the only person whose elevation will decrease, not increase, the number of men who are insulted enough to fight about it." "Them? The North has declared itself," a voice began, and Sansa stood without looking at Jon and said, very clearly, "The North declared itself because there was no one to trust. We are, it seems, invited to trust now. If we do not take the invitation, we will have made ourselves liars and cowards. I do not propose to become either. The North will enter this compact on terms we will state publicly and keep. We will be governed by a king who remembers that winter kills kings and peasants as if they are kin. We will not be tithes to a southern whim, but we will not pretend that an island can float without a sea." "Then?" Gendry Baratheon stood like an anvil and shrugged, as if the weight of this were something he was used to shouldering. "I make things," he said. "I can promise to make spears and plows and not swords unless we must. I never knew my father, but I knew his shadow well enough to be wary of men who think their blood is a better coin than their hands. This man fought beside me and didn't ask me to call him anything but Jon. I'll call him king if that's the name that makes the others stop fighting." "That isn't so." Arianne Martell's dark eyes were amused and alert at once. She said, "Dorne remembers enough to be careful. But we also remember men who insisted on burning messages rather than reading them. We will not make that mistake again. My uncle had a taste for quiet roads. I propose we try walking one. And if the king walks beside us..." Yara Greyjoy laughed in a way that made the cautious reach for their cups with two hands. "We don't love kings," she said. "We love the sight of land and the feeling that we can take it if it's easy. But we've learned about taking what we can't keep. I'd try keeping something for a change. Why not keep peace? It's cheaper than ships." They watched Jon as if their watching could decide what he would be. He thought of another time he had been watched by men in fur and rags, who had asked if he would lead because their choices had come down to the cold and the thing beyond it. He thought of how he had failed and how he had not, and how often those two things were the same thing from different hilltops. He stepped forward into the open place that had been left, not by courtesy, but by necessity. The snow caught in his hair and it melted there and ran down the back of his neck like a thin finger of ice. "My father was a good man," he said, and the word did not catch. Both of them. One raised me to speak truth, even when it pulled a man's jaw out of its comfortable hinge. One died for a woman, and for a promise, and for a child who never got to pretend that the truth was something that happened to other people. I have no wish to sit any chair that makes honest men bend their knees. But I have fought beside many of you. I have watched you die. And I have died. If I can spare boys from learning what it feels like to have a man bleed out under your hands while you lie to him, that it will be all right because you cannot think of the true words to say, then I will do what I must. If I am to be your king, it will not be because of the way my name tastes to you. It will be because winter taught us we are very small and very stubborn, and that the only way we survive is by standing close enough to share breath. Then see. He looked at Sansa. He looked at Arya and saw only the suggestion of a shadow that had been paying attention. He looked at Davos, who nodded as if to say that words were only fish and that a man still had to feed people. He looked at Tyrion, whose mouth made a shape that might have been gratitude and might have been relief. And with Tyrion you never knew which would be more dangerous. He looked at Ghost, who was simply there, and felt himself return to the center of his bones. "I will make terms plain," he said. "The North will not be milked like a cow in summer. Dorne will not be ordered to plant trees by men who have never seen a desert. The Iron Islands will not be told to pitch their boats to catch fish the way the Mander flows. But roads will be mended. Bread will be counted. Men who sell grain dear in a famine will have their names carved on stones as a warning. There will be a book called Debts, and a book called Mercy, and I will keep both myself, and I will see which is heavier. If you want a king who will wear a crown like a toy and rule like a story where heroes never have to wash their feet, do not choose me. If you want a man who will be as weary of pride as he is of war, I am here and I am what I am. A Stark of Winterfell and Aegon Targaryen, son of a prince who did not finish his song and a girl who loved him anyway." Then the snow fell, and somewhere in the city a bell rang that had nothing to do with the council and everything to do with the hour of a baker's labor. Men murmured. The factor lifted one palm as if balancing a weight invisible to all but him. Maester Lothar clucked softly to himself and wrote in a margin that would later be argued over. "How shall we choose?" Maribald's daughter asked the assembly, and if she had been one of the seven, her expression would have been that of the stranger with the hood thrown back, showing the face of a woman who had forgotten how to be afraid. "By truth," said Howland Reed, unexpected as a reed slicing through ore splash. "By root and branch, by counting as if numbers are truths, by hearing a man's name and understanding that he did not choose it, but that he can choose what he does with it. By voice," said Tyrion, weary of ceremony. "And let us find out if the realm can agree to speak in one for once." They called for votes not by the lifting of hands, because hands are easily coerced, but by stones. Each house had been given a bowl of river rock, smooth and gray. 3 urns had been set on the dais. One painted with the direwolf and the dragon together. One with the 7-pointed star for a regency to be chosen by lot. One with a blank face for those who preferred to break the game board and fight over the pieces. The last was the urn that frightened Jon, because men love the taste of ruin if they can call it sweet by another name. Sansa's face did not change, but her fingers twitched once at the cloth of her skirt. Arya drifted near enough that he could feel her attention. Davos craned his neck like a man trying to see the dice before they fall. The urns waited, humility forced upon clay because men had asked them to carry a realm's pride. It took time. It took the measure of a winter morning. The stones clicked softly, like the knees of old men on a cold stair. None of the old songs were sung. None of the old banners rustled except where drafts found them. The world narrowed to sound and to waiting. When the counting began, it was Maester Lothar who read. He did not try to gild the numbers. For a while, Mercy and debt seemed neck and neck. And then the direwolf and the dragon began to outpace fear and habit. The urn that argued for some council without a king had its persuasive moment, and then lost it, not because men loved kings, but because men loved something stable underneath their feet when the wind blew. Even the Vale accepted to put stones where their mouths had confessed a wish for order. Dorne added their count when Arianne gave the smallest tilt of her head to an old man with a face like seasoned wood. The Reach spilled a river of pebbles into the wolf and dragon's clay mouth, and for once did not boast about irrigation. Lannister stones came late. Tyrion did not put his in himself. He handed it to a thin woman at his shoulder, whose hair had gone white, not from age, but from something salt and fierce and private. She walked to the urn without hurry and let the stone go, as if it were a wish for something she had already decided would not come true, but might still be worth the hoping. When it was done, there were numbers. The numbers were not a hammer blow, not a crown dropped onto a kneeling boy's head, while choristers breathed in on cue. The numbers were what they were. Enough. Davos said later in a low voice when they stood alone at the back of the hall. Enough to feed a man until supper and keep him standing. Maribald's daughter lifted her chin. It is decided, she said, and there was no joy in her voice and no triumph in it either. Only the relief of a woman who had delivered a child, and both were breathing. Aegon Targaryen, called Jon Snow, son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, is chosen by the realm to be crowned King of the Andals, and the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the realm. Sansa stood. It was not a flourish. It was simply a woman getting to her feet, because she had something to do next. She came down the stairs and stopped before Jon and looked at him for a long moment that contained landscapes and years. Then she went to one knee, not as a sister to a brother, not as a child to a parent, not as a lord bending to a conqueror, but as a steward of a house to the man she had decided to trust, because the alternative was to decide to trust no one ever again, and she was done with that particular winter. The North, she said quietly, bends the knee to its own blood and to the safety of the realm. We will hold you to the vows you spoke, and you will hold us to ours. Then Gendry came forward and knelt with the earnest clumsiness of a man who had not practiced kneeling in front of anyone since he stopped being a boy who cleaned chimneys for coins. Arianne inclined her head and did not kneel because Dorne does not kneel to be courteous, and no one asked her to betray her desert to make a point. Yara crossed her arms and grinned and said, "All right then, your grace," like a dare, and the Ironborn behind her rolled their eyes, as if to say that even the sea had to admit the land existed sometimes. The Reach knelt in a wave of fabric and calculation. The Vale knelt stiffly but thoroughly. Edmure Tully fumbled and smiled, and did not make a fool of himself, which was a victory that made Sansa's mouth soften for an instant. Tyrion did not kneel. He bowed, very deep, because his back could do so, and because he had chosen a small humiliation for himself rather than a large one for anyone else. When he straightened, his eyes were bright, with something that could have been wine, or could have been relief. He came forward enough to be heard and said, in a voice that fit the moment like a well-made glove, "Your Grace, you will need a hand." Jon thought of 1,000 hands. Hands covered in black filth from the wall stoves, and hands scarred by rope, and hands bloodied in battle, and hands that had held his as he died, and hands that had raised him, and hands that had cut his throat, and hands that had stitched a banner. He thought of the sword of the hand, and of the burden of a hand, and of who he could trust to put his hand into that cuff. He looked at Sansa. He looked at Davos. He looked at Tyrion. "I will need many hands," he said, dry and not unkind. "I am not a spider. I do not spin a web. I am not a dragon. I do not hoard. I am a man. I will take all the hands that wish to help build, and I will swat away the hands that reach to steal." He paused, and the smile tried to come to his mouth, and he allowed it this once. "Sir Davos Seaworth," he said. How do you feel about counting fish and men until our heads hurt less? Davos' ears went red in the clean, honest way they did when a word touched a part of him that was shy. I can count, Your Grace, he said. And I can tell truth. The first is useful. The second is likely to make enemies. We'll give you a sword, Arya called out from somewhere entirely other than where she had been. And the sound of laughter ran through the benches, like a thaw loosening a river without breaking it. It was not mirthless. It did not ring with hysteria. It was a human sound, and Jon felt it enter him, as if his chest had been a hall that had been shut up too long, and had needed its shutters thrown open. The rest of the day filled itself with smaller ceremonies, with the quills of clerks and the jests of soldiers, and the way men who had not wanted to make this choice began to find that their pride could live under it if they fed it carefully on condition and favor. There were petitions that had waited months and had decided now was the best time to present themselves. About a farmstead on a border whose fence had never been important until a hungry year made it so. About a woman who had wed a man who had two names, and now a third, and wanted a contract that said she was wife to all of him. There were quietly made treaties, drawn up with the speed of men who have always kept their stores of such papers within reach. When dusk came and the dragon pit stones drank the last of the day, Jon went to stand at the mouth of it and looked out over the city. Fires wrote a constellation upon the earth. He could not see the small people who made them. He could imagine a woman turning a spit and a boy blowing on his fingers, and an old man telling a story about a king he had once seen at a distance, who had sneezed like a human, and now was remembered as a giant. He could smell the brine when the wind turned its head from the bay. Ghost pressed his weight against Jon's leg. We'll get colder before we get warmer, Jon said to the wolf, who had never expected otherwise of the world. Behind him, he heard a soft step. It will not end here, Sansa said, and it was not a warning. It was a truth, laid on the table like a loaf. I know, Jon said. He had not expected it to end anywhere. He had expected, once, long ago, to end. That had been simpler. There will be men who pretend they did not vote as they did. There will be women whose husbands will say they changed their minds for them after they went home. There will be someone who will find a new story to tell about an old grievance. Them? Sansa stood with her hands tucked into her sleeves, her breath making a small cloud that drifted and vanished. We will make a court that hears such grievances without needing to make new graves to silence them. She said, we will build a winter garden with glass, where people can see green in a cold month, and remember that their children need to be fed more than their pride. We will send letters, not soldiers, to the places that have gotten used to seeing only the latter. We will use the wall for something other than a prayer. We will ask men to tell us how much wood they will need 5 years from now, and we will take them seriously when they answer. Bendo. Jon looked at her. You have a list. I always do, Sansa said. The first thing on it is, do not die. The second is, do not lie unless the truth would kill a good man. The third is, learn the names of the women who bake bread in the castle, and ask them if the ovens are going to crack. Medin? He breathed out and watched that breath go. We will fail, he said, as if to mark the place they stood. We will fail, and then try again, and call the trying a victory, if the failing does not burn down the world. That is all any king has ever done, Sansa said. The difference will be that you will know it. Winds rattled the broken stones. Far away, a dog barked, as if remembering something important. The night among the city's roofs promised 1,000 tragedies and comedies. Above, the sky was tender with stars. Jon thought of the boy he had been who had believed that honor was a straight road, and of the man he was who had learned that it was a stagger with one more step forward than back. He was tired. He was, in an odd way, lighter than he had been that morning in the Godswood. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, Sansa agreed. They went down the stairs together. In the yard below, work did not pause for kings. A woman salted a haunch with hands that made the gesture sacred by repetition. A man counted arrows with his lips moving, not because he could not count otherwise, but because he liked the taste of the numbers. A child slept with his mouth open in a basket near the coals. A warm animal in a world that would try to teach him to be cold. And then, if he were lucky, show him who had the skill to keep a fire secretly alive in winter in a way that did not scorch the house. Jon passed them all with Ghost at his heel, and the weight of a choice on his shoulders, and the sound of snow on stone like the faintest applause. In the quiet of the long house, Sansa had commandeered. Davos sat with a ledger that had once been nothing but blank lines, and now held the beginnings of a country. He looked up. "So," he said, "you're a king." Jon unfastened his cloak with numb fingers and hung it on a peg. "I'm a man who'll have to learn how to not drown," he said. Davos grinned. "Well, I can teach you that," he said. "First, keep your head above water. Second, don't swallow what you can spit out. Third, learn to float when you have to." Jon nodded. He felt the tiredness reach for him with soft hands. "Good," he said. "Tomorrow we start with bread, and with wood, and with a garden made of glass, and with writing letters," came Arya's voice from a fold of shadow that could not possibly have fit a girl, and did. "Because if you don't write to Nymeria and ask her to keep your southern wolves in line, I will." "Write them yourself," Sansa said, unpinning her hair at last. "You always sign your name like a knife point. Perhaps they'll mind the shape of it." "Perhaps," Arya said, and her grin was a light. "And perhaps I'll take a trip down the King's Road to make sure words are working as well as they should." "Don't stab anyone important," Sansa said. "Define important." "Anyone who will ruin Stu if he dies." Arya thought, solemn for a heartbeat, and then nodded. "All right." Howland Reed lay already on his pallet, eyes open like a man in the reeds waiting for a fish to rise. He said, without looking at anyone, "The swamp teaches you to stand on many small things and call it ground. Remember that." Jon lay down. Ghost settled with his head on Jon's folded arm. Tyrion's laughter drifted in from a neighboring room, and then ceased as if someone had set a hand gently over his mouth to remind him there were other people sleeping. The city exhaled. Out beyond the hills, the sea turned in its bed. In Winterfell, the heart tree listened to snow. In the morning, there would be a crown that needed to be forged without burning the hair off the head that would wear it. There would be men with lists. There would be a woman with a list who would make the men's lists better. There would be a book called Debts, and a book called Mercy, and the pages of both would not be long enough to keep the world from bleeding. But they might teach it that the bleeding could be stemmed. Sleep took him, as if he were a boy again in a bed, under an eave, where the snow's weight made the roof creak. And in his dream, he walked along a road where a wolf ran and a dragon glided not above him, but beside him. And the road did not narrow but widened, just enough for one more pair of feet at a time. Ka. Dawn came thin and pearled. A light washed through cloud as if the day had been scrubbed before being set on the sky. Jon woke to the sound of men shaking frost from canvas and the smell of porridge, with apples dried and softened back toward fruit. The long house had gathered the breaths of 100 sleepers and turned them into a kind of sea noise. Now it exhaled them into the cold until they were nothing. Ghost rose first, as he always did, with a shake that sent a mist of frost from his coat. Jon put his boots on while the leather was still stiff, and felt the stiffness in his own hands answering. The first work of the morning was not crowns. It was numbers and wood. A carpenter from the Stormlands, shoulder like a beam, hair cut blunt with a knife, stood over a plan Sansa had coaxed onto parchment the night before. "Glass," he said skeptically, tracing a line in the air. "I can frame it. But that much glass takes a patience our boys don't have. And money. And sand. Then sea." "Mir has the craft," the factor said, appearing at Jon's shoulder as if he had been present all along and had simply waited until politeness dictated that he manifest. "Lys boasts about it. Tyrosh quarrels over it. I can produce pains that will bear the weight of this winter if I set the quarrelers to bidding against one another and make them think they are cheating me." "We won't take on debt to make a garden," Davos said. He had a stick of charcoal and a careful hand for figures. "Not while we're counting bread." "You mistake the nature of debt," the factor said mildly. Sometimes it is an understanding written down. Sometimes it is loaves taken now against grain, promised next harvest. Sometimes it is simply goodwill put into words. You wish this city to see green in winter. Goodwill counts green among its varieties. The ovens. Sansa reminded, scanning a list that had grown new limbs overnight. We start with the ovens. End with wood. If the bakers can't keep their heat, the greenhouse won't persuade anyone of our competence. I'd rather 1,000 loaves than one sheet of glass today. Now, the carpenter nodded, relieved to be asked for something wood could do. There's a pine stand 5 miles south that the war missed, and a grove of chestnut in the western hills that didn't. I'll need men and oxen, and a promise that we won't strip one hill naked because it's closest. Promise, Jon said. You'll choose men who'll replant what they cut. Send for acorns. Send for saplings from the gods' wood if the ground will take them. That's slow work for a hungry city, the carpenter said. But there was no mockery in it. Men who worked growing things understood slowness as a tool, not an insult. Scribes came and went with their heads down as if their quills would take fright if they saw the people they were recording. A woman with hair plaited like a rope around her crown brought a roll of names for bakers who needed wood in their ovens and salt in their dough to keep the loaves from going stale too soon. A man with a nose broken long ago brought the list of the city watch's sergeants who could be trusted not to look the other way when a rich man's boy took a loaf, because his father had told him he was hungry by definition. Jon signed his first entries into the book he had named Mercy. Not grandly, but so that the first thing the city would see written in the new king's hand was permission rather than a tax. Bread for a widow whose husband had been pressed into a levy by a lord long dead. A respite on rent for a cobbler whose stall had been burned by men celebrating the end of a war they hadn't fought in. A blanket for an old woman who had given up her blanket to a child because the child had teeth that still needed the world to be soft. None of it much, each line a stitch in a rent he could not mend with Run Siam. In the book called Debts, he entered his own name first. It steadied him. A debt owed to Winterfell for men taken south. A debt to the Riverlands for grain he meant to ask them to send without being asked for coin up front. A debt to Dorne for glass and sand and patience. Under those he wrote smaller obligations as neatly as he could. To a mason for patching a crack in a wall so that the wind would not find the baby in the corner. To a fisherman for taking boys out to teach them to mend nets and not to cut their hands on rope. Look at that, Davos murmured, his mouth turning down, which for him meant a smile. You start a reign by owing the world and feeding it. I've seen worse ledgers. Nendar. Tyrion drifted through the room as if he had misplaced something and was pretending he had meant to. He stopped at the book long enough to be seen, not long enough to make it his business, then moved on to the group of guild representatives who had gathered like cats around a hearth. He had the knack of being present in 3 conversations without trying to steal any of them. It was a gift. It was also a danger. Jon took careful note that Tyrion was content to talk about grain weights and wages, and not the shape of any crown. Howland Reed stood by the open door, untroubled by the draft. He watched the yard with the expression of a man who could look into water and see the fish, even when everyone else saw only light. When Arya slipped past him headed for the city with a loaf wrapped in a cloth and a bundle of letters tucked into her belt, he did not stir, only said, "Do not take a road that thinks itself safe. Take one that thinks itself easy. Roads don't think," Arya said, grinning over her shoulder. "Exactly," Howland said. Jon's first formal audience was with the bakers. The woman with the plaited hair spoke for them, and she did not waste words. "If you bring wood, we'll bring bread," she said. "If the wood is green, we'll curse you and burn our hands. If the men you send to carry it are the sort who try to take our girls into corners, we'll break their wrists with peels and bring the broken wrists to your door." "Break the wrist and bring the man, not the wrist," Sansa said. "We'll write his name in the book called Fool and see if he's interested in a voyage to Skagos. I hear the air is bracing." "Don't let him stay in the city," the baker said. "Men are like leaven. The wrong kind spoils the whole dough." "We'll keep the ovens hot," Jon said. We'll keep your hands from burning as best we can. When you need salt, you'll have a way to ask for it without begging. I'll send boys to sweep your chimneys." He kept the crown talk for last. He had learned one lesson at Winterfell, and at the Wall both. That men ate better when their bellies and their pride both received attention in the order in which hunger insisted. But the morning could not get away from him forever, and when Tyrion's shadow lengthened under the doorway, he knew it was time to go see the chair everyone was pretending not to whisper about. The Red Keep had learned to behave like an old soldier who has taken a wound badly and mended anyway. It did not creak, but you could sense the places where stone had been asked to do what it had not been shaped for, and had complied because there had been no other choice. The throne room had been rebuilt under men who had liked the taste of spectacle. A new dais had been constructed with steps wide enough to make kneeling a part of the ascent without having to say so aloud. The Iron Throne sat at the top like a lesson that had outlived its teacher. It was, to Jon's eye, less monstrous than he had imagined when he had been a boy hearing about it. It was not a mountain of swords or a beast about to bite. It was a chair hammered together by men who had wanted to ensure that anyone sitting it remembered that edges existed. He ran a gloved hand along one arm and felt old ridges and the smooth polish of many hands that had not been cut by them. Ghost sniffed it and sneezed, as if to say that steel was steel, and a chair was a chair, and neither had ever impressed a wolf. "I don't know if I'll sit it," Jon said straightforwardly. "Then don't," Sansa said. "Not for counting, not for judging bread, not for anything but ceremony. Let it be what it has always wanted to be. A story. Sit at a table when you are being useful. Sit on a chair with arms when you are being seen. Sit on the ground when a child is telling you a thing he learned, and you ought to be smaller than he is for a moment, so that he will be big. Menders. A king who wants sit his throne." The voice was amused, dry as a plum left out for a monk. Tyrion stepped around a column, hands open to show he had not been hiding anything but had simply been curious. "We can be practical with symbols. An empty throne in a full court is better than a full throne in an empty one. My throne is a plank table with a ledger and a bowl of apples," Jon said. "This," he gestured, "is a memory. It will be useful at moments when men need to feel as if their choices have been rubbed with oil and lifted high." "Damn. That was beautifully said," Tyrion observed. "Have you considered hiring a scribe who can keep up with you?" "Hire me one," Jon said. "Preferably one who still possesses all his fingers and uses them for work." "I shall find a boy who can write with either hand," Tyrion said. "That way, if he's careless and burns one, I can keep him employed." Brienne arrived with 3 captains of the city watch. She had the look of a woman who had rehearsed several conversations and was prepared to be reasonable for exactly as long as it did not make the city bleed. "The watch was bought twice this month before it could go on being loyal," she said without ornament. "Once by a man with a purse, who wanted to know where bread would be handed out, and once by a man with a grudge, who wanted to know where it would not." "We'll pay them ourselves," Jon said, "and not in promises. We'll change the surgeons who sign the rolls each quarter. If I can help it, they won't know which week I'm coming to spot check. If there's a man who sells a post, I want to know if the post was worth buying and whom he took money from last year." "Ma'am?" "Oh, you're making a list," Brienne noted, approval so quiet it came like a clink of a dropped coin. "I'm making 2, Jon said. "The Book of Debts is mine. The Book of Mercy is mine. But there will be a 3rd book, the book called Watch. I'll ask the baker's woman to enter the first name in it." Brienne nodded. "Maiden's truth," she murmured, under her breath, and for herself, as if to test whether it tasted familiar. The godswood inside the Red Keep was not large enough for wolves to run. What it offered was a space where trees remembered winter, and leaves remembered the sound of people who came to speak near them, and accidentally found themselves saying more than planned. Jon went there in the afternoon with Howland Reed and Sansa Dye. The heart tree's face here was a careful piece of art, an attempt, its features precise where Winterfell's was old and worn. The gardener had scraped snow away from the roots as if they were a sleeping animal, and he did not wish to wake it. Jon knelt because his knees asked it of him. Not because the tree did. I will do the southern part of this where men can see and make their vows aloud," he said quietly. "But I will promise something in front of this tree that we can keep private." "What?" Sansa asked, not challenging, only wanting to know what she was being asked to share. "That we will do our best not to be made foolish by pride," Jon said. "That we will let other people be right when they are, even if we would rather be clever than correct. That we will stand up when it is easier to sit and sit when standing would be theater. That we will eat when we are hungry and sleep when our eyes burn, and not call it heroic to starve ourselves of either." Sansa added, "I will vow that. And I will vow to learn the names of those women and men who keep the ovens from cracking. The things you asked me to promise to the tree in Winterfell, I will promise here too, for this city." Then Damal. Howland Reed bent and placed his palm flat on the bark without speaking. He closed his eyes like a man who had learned that the way to make the world quiet wasn't to demand silence, but to become it. When he opened them, he looked toward the dragon pit, as if the city's dragonless ribcage were a creature he could understand if it would only stop pretending to be dead. "Crown," he said, the word chafed smooth and plain. "Make it in the sight of a tree and of a forge." "You'll do both," Sansa decided. A crown hammered in a forge and cooled in a bowl of water with leaves floating in it. "Is that a thing?" Jon asked. "It is now," Sansa said. "Gendry found them without being sought, which was a smith's gift. He had brought sketches on scraps of wax tablet and a small coil of beaten gold salvaged from a chest someone had been meaning to open for 3 years. "If you want rubies," he said, "you'll be wanting to ask a Hightower or some man with a boat on a river south of here. I have garnets. They're honest stones. They don't pretend to be nothing but themselves. I want iron," Jon said, "and something that will not make the neck sweat." Gendry scratched his jaw, thinking of humid summers and the weight of metal on skin. "Iron's cheap and sure," he said. "You put it on your head, and you remember what you carry. But iron stains. Your hair will look like a man too long under a bridge. There's winter steel I could temper. I've a bar of it left from a man who'd no business ordering the thing he ordered, and he died before he could pay for it. The color of winter steel is clean. It holds an edge. It doesn't run. Danto. Winter steel," Jon said, tasting the word. "And a line of river gold. The smallest." He traced with his finger the line where the metal would catch light. "No stones. If you must add a shape, put a drop of glass the color of smoke where the bands cross." "Wolf and dragon?" Gendry asked, the corner of his mouth thinking about acting like a smile. "Neither," Jon said. "Let those beasts be on cloth. The crown can be a river of winter metal running into a band of gold that came out of the earth because men were patient. That is what this is." "Nay," Gendry grunted, and that was praise. "You'll come to the forge," he said. "If you don't, I'll bring the hammer to your table." "I'll come," Jon said, "and I'll use the hammer." The forge kept its own season. The world inside it had one weather. Heat that licked at a man's face and throat and made his eyes water and his breath taste of iron. Boys worked the bellows with a rhythm that had been taught and then made their own. Jon stood stripped to his shirt in the blast of the fire and lifted the hammer with a hand that had learned the sword first. It was different. A hammer is not a blade. It does not argue with the air. It demands it move. Gendry set the bar of winter steel and nodded. "Here," he said, the word spare as a swallow's tail. Jon brought the hammer down. The vibration traveled up his bones into his shoulder, and then into his chest, as if the metal had rung inside him. He lifted, brought it down again. The second strike met a different metal, because it met a changed one. Each blow made a new world for the next blow. He learned the way the bar stretched, the way it wanted to be strip, and then circle. The way it remembered being ore, until it forgot, and became only what he forced it into being. Sweat stung his skin. Light pooled and ran like something alive on the work. He did not think of thrones. He thought of horseshoes. He thought of a hinge for a door in a winter storm. He thought of a ring a woman might wear without ever knowing what it cost the miner to bring the vein up into day, and then thought of the miner, and made his arm fall a fraction differently so that the crown would feel no cruelty in it. When the band had been joined, Gendry took it with tongs and set it in the bowl Sansa had prepared. Leaves floated in the water because she had said they must. Heartleaf and laurel and a sprig of something brought from the neck that smelled of clean wet. Steam lifted. The water sighed as if it had been waiting to be asked to do this small sacrament. "Good," Gendry said, satisfied. "Now, the gold." Gold behaved as it always had, like the sun's lazy brother who could be coaxed to work only if the day were pleasant. Jon cut his hand on a small burr when they seeded the thin line, and his blood made a bead on his skin that ink would envy. He watched it fall onto the floor and disappear into ash, and could not escape the plain symbolism of it. He had put blood into this thing whether he'd meant to or no. "Any crown worth wearing has blood in it," Gendry said, practical. "Better your own than someone else." They carried the crown in a cloth to the godswood because that was what they had said they would do. And because if you do not keep the small vows, it is foolish to think you can keep the large. Howland Reed did not touch it, but inhaled quietly, as if the wet metal had a smell only he could notice. He murmured something in a language the old tongue had once worn when it wanted to be soft. Jon did not ask what it meant, not because he did not want to know, but because he trusted the man to have said the right thing to the right thing. They did not set a date. The city set it for them. Banners multiplied as if from the air. A smith's boy turned the wolf and dragon into charcoal on a wall, and a man selling pea soup pressed the boy's hair as if he had blessed him. A woman who had sworn 2 years ago never to attend another public revel, because the last had ended in screaming, set out a comb she had been saving to sell, and let a girl with blue ribbons pick one ribbon and tie it around a braid. Games appeared in the square. Knucklebones, cards, a game with carved little men that march along a board to catch a castle, and men and boys, and some women hunched over them with concentration that kept their minds from wandering into fear. The city had been starving for a reason to stand together and find out if it could. The morning of the coronation broke clear. It was not warm. It was not merciless. The snow held off long enough for the city to dress itself. Sansa oversaw the laying of boards across muddy places. Arya vanished before dawn and reappeared before noon, with a small boy on her shoulders, who later insisted he had ridden a wolf through the city. Davos walked the perimeter twice and returned with a list of weak points he handed to Brienne, whose eyes moved down it with grim pleasure. The factor inspected the urns of coin that would be scattered in measured handfuls. Men could bite their neighbor over a copper. He meant them to bite only the air with laughter. Maester Lothar stood with a parchment on which he had written the names of those who would say a ritual or a word, and left space for the forgotten. Jon dressed without fuss in wool and leather. Sansa had argued him into a shirt with a small embroidery at the throat that married a thread of black and a thread of gray in a pattern only visible if the light caught it. She had argued him out of a velvet cloak on the grounds that velvet season was not winter. He pulled on boots that had known roads and wore a belt that had held a sword and a child's little wooden knife, both at different times, and had learned not to protest objects of different weights. Ghost followed him with the unself-conscious majesty of an animal that has never thought about paper or oaths, and yet keeps them more perfectly than men do. They began in the Red Keep's godswood because they had promised. Howland Reed and Sansa stood with him. Sam was there, breath visible, hands steady for once without having to ask them to be. Jon knelt and put his hand on the cold bark and said, "Without ceremony, I will try to do right by my people. I will spare them where I can and harden them where I must. When I am proud, make me clumsy, so I will see it. When I am tired, remind me to eat and sleep and hold my sister's hand." "You can hold it now," Sansa said, taking his hand and squeezing it with a strength that startled him even now. "Do not forget the small roads." Howland said softly, and touched his wrist and was done. Then they walked up to the dragon pit, along a path made different by the stepping of many feet. Bells rang where there were bells, and where there were none men made noise with their voices, and with sticks struck against their own palms, and with the simple joy of stamping their feet on the boards Sansa had laid. The city did not sing in unison, but in a loud, willing mishmash. like a market where everyone is haggling toward the same price. The banners lifted and fell. The wolf quick shadow, and the dragon's 3 heads side by side, and somewhere a boy began to understand that pictures could make men walk differently. The dais had been plain yesterday. This morning it wore garlands. Winter had little to spare, but a gardener had found ivy stubborn on a wall, and women had cut lengths of it and braided it about rope. It was not lush. It was proof that green does not surrender out of politeness. The urns had been removed. In their place stood a wooden table covered by a woven cloth with maps of the 7 kingdoms stitched upon it in progress not yet complete. The riverlands were finished, the reach half-stitched, Dorne only outlined. Sansa's doing. She had ordered the cloth hung so that everyone could see how far was done, and how far yet to go. Maribald's daughter spoke first again, and this time her voice carried warmth where yesterday it had carried only discipline. "You did not come for me," she said bluntly. "You came to see if you could stand near your neighbors and not wish to kill them. Your success thus far is a miracle I will give thanks for tonight in whatever small place I keep for God. The realm has chosen. We will not pretend the choosing solved hunger or cured pride. We will pretend nothing. We will make something. That is the difference." She looked at Jon, unblinking. "Kneel." He did. He knelt on boards laid by men with numb fingers. And he did not think about how he looked. He thought about the feeling in his knees, and about the sense of the wood under them, and about how a man who kneels in winter learns to stand fast afterward, because the bones remember the cold. Sam held the crown. Gendry stood near enough to be inspected, and mightily unconcerned with inspections. Sansa took the crown from Sam because that was the path that had been decided, and because there are some things sisters must do for brothers, or no one will. She held it for a breath and then lowered it. The winter steel kissed Jon's hair. The gold line caught a single pale thread and made it shine. The small bit of smoky glass took the light and refused to hoard it. "Rise," Sansa said. It was not a command. It was an invitation. He rose. If he expected to feel taller or smaller or heavier, he was disappointed or relieved. He could not decide which. He felt only himself, which would have to suffice. The crown sat on his hair like a hand that did not squeeze. If the world had been a bard's story, someone would have shouted something memorable. If it had been a mummer's play, someone would have tripped. Instead, the sound that came was a human one. The crowd released breath. Then men and women clapped their hands, not in perfect rhythm, not long, but with an honest pleasure that surprised Jon by its lack of hysteria. Ghost barked once. Sharp. A thin boy near the front laughed at the sound and then covered his mouth, his eyes wide as if he had committed a sin. Jon looked at him and nodded until the boy's hands came down and his mouth widened into a grin. Tyrion came forward, head bent, and offered a small ring with the shape of a hand upon it. Jon took it, weighed it, and turned. "Ser Davos Seaworth," he said, "you told me truth when it would have eased you to lie, and you saved my life when you had no reason but decency. I ask you to be my hand. Count my fish. Count my men. Count my lies. Hit me with a truth hard enough to bruise when I need it." Davos opened his mouth and shut it again. He knelt without elegance and held out his hand. Jon slid the ring onto it. The crowd liked that moment. It was easy to like. A man who looked like the sea receiving a ring shaped like the thing he had done all his life with the hands he had. In such small consistencies, men find hope that the larger ones are possible. "Maester Lothar," Jon said, turning slightly, "you have more law in your head than is good for a man. You will sit near me and tell me which old words we must keep and which we may go around." He looked then to the side. "Bacter, da. You will not hold an office, but you will speak bluntly when we play games that cost men bread. You will remind me that a city's heart is coined only when a man has never gone hungry." Bah. The Braavosi inclined his head, as if a bargain had been struck that pleased him more for having been made without being written down. "Tyrion Lannister," Jon said last, because it was a name men in this place had learned to hold like a knife. "You will be my master of laws. You told me once a story about arithmetic. I ask you to count consequences where other men will count smiles. And to write the words we will choose to be bound by, and to bind others. Da. Tyrion's bow was not deep. It was exact. I will argue with you so much you will wish you had chosen a quieter man, he said. I expect to wish many things, Jon answered. Arianne Martell came forward after the oaths of office and lifted a cup of wine. Dorne does not kneel, she said with the poise of a woman who knows that if she repeats a sentence often enough it becomes a spell. We bend our heads only for shade and for wisdom. This is a good shade. I hope it will be wise. Dannen? We will let you keep your own laws where they do no harm, Jon said. We will ask for your counsel where ours will cause harm if left alone. And when we wish for trees, we will ask how you grow orchards out of dust. She laughed with genuine delight. You will be a difficult man to hate, she said. This will be tiresome for my enemies. Gendry raised his hammer once toward the crowd, and the men of the Stormlands roared, as if one of their own had won a wrestling match. Yara lifted 2 fingers without making a show of it, like an oath given at sea to a god who is too busy to be pleased by pageantry. Royce nodded, carved oak pretending to be a man. Edmure Tully beamed as if a harvest had come in before the storm. Maribald's daughter concluded with a blessing that said nothing about 7 or gods or dragons, and much about hands and bread. The city dispersed the way water does, smoothly, around obstacles, with eddies that would eventually become stories. The crown turned to a weight Jon could forget at times in the way men forget their own breath, only noticing when it changes. He turned away from the dais and found Sansa's eyes. There was no triumph there. There was satisfaction. It would do. The rest of the day became a map of errands and parchments. The first letter went north. Jon wrote it himself, without waiting for a scribe beyond Sam to sand the ink, and addressed it to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He paused for the name, and then wrote a blank line. Because whatever name he wrote there would be truth. And he did not trust his memory to be current. And because he meant the salutation more than the title anyway. Brothers, he wrote, and felt his hand want to slow. I write as a man who stood your ground and left it not because I tired of the wind, but because the wind pushed me to another hill. I will not insult you by telling you how to keep your vows. I ask only that you send me a list of what you need and a list of what you will not take, because men sometimes offer what costs them nothing. We will turn the gift into bread. We will set men to plow who are tired of killing. There will be those who say that this is an invitation to those beyond the wall to come and trade, and it is. I ask you to choose merchants as carefully as you choose rangers. A man trusted to bring back grain should be trusted as if he were bringing back men. When you lack wood, send word. When you lack boys, send word. When you lack hope, say nothing. We will send you something anyway. He signed with the winter steel crown sketched small by Sam's personal flourish and sealed it with wax stamped by the wolf and the dragon running together. He sent the raven into the cold with a private thought for the bird, who would have to cut the wind the way a knife cuts meat, and then find a gate where a boy remembered to feed him for having done a hard thing. There were letters to the Mander and to Sunspear and to Casterly Rock and Highgarden, if there was still a Highgarden that deserved letters and not archaeologists. There were letters to the Iron Islands, where Yara had promised to keep the raiding men strapped close, as if she could turn an entire people into reef-knotted rope, to the Vale, where roads could be made safe for carts, if pride could be redirected from family squabbles, to the satisfaction of seeing a wheel turn smoothly. To White Harbor, asking the Manderlists to be as calculating as they always had been, but in the service of feeding others this time. In the small room Sansa had appropriated for the day's writing, Arya dropped onto a stool with a thump and tossed a folded parcel on the table. A boy in Flea Bottom says he saw a man telling men who'd lost money at Knucklebones that they had a right to take more from a baker than had give them. She said, I told him I'd tell the king, and then I told him if he was there to see it again to tie his shoelace in the man's legs and leave the rest to luck. That is not the sort of policy we can write down, Sansa said. but I have no objection to it being tried. We'll move the bread to 2 places tomorrow and keep them guessing," Davos suggested. "And we'll put 2 women with peels by the door. There's a sort of man who's scared of a woman with the right tool in her hand." "Good," Sansa said, already making 3 clean notes where Jon would have written 1 long line and then tried to add to it and crossed it out. "And we'll send a watch patrol to do nothing more heroic than stand there and look bored. Some men will behave if they believe they are being ignored by authority. It confuses their sense of theater." "Bell? Howland?" Jon asked. The Crannogmen had come and gone again without Creek. He appeared in the doorway with the ghost of a smile. "We will go to the river tonight," he said. "A quiet coronation is for the gods. A quiet act is for the river. If you feed it, it remembers." "Feed it what?" Arya asked, interested already. "Bread," Howland said. "And this." He opened his palm to show a ring of rushes woven into a circle. "And something of his," he added, looking at Jon. "A hair. A coin he is not counting." A word spoken and then swallowed. "Bendamto. Bread I can spare," Jon said. "Coins I cannot count I will try to find." A word spoken and swallowed. "There are so many." They went as dusk bruised the city's edges. No banners. No watch. Ghost at heel. Howland led them down a stair knotted with roots and into a place where the river lapped a small worn stone like a tongue. He set the ring of rushes on the water, and it sat a moment, amazed to be afloat, then drifted into the weak current and turned as if looking back. Jon tore a soft loaf and dropped the pieces one by one. Ghost watched with the intentness of a hunter shown something he knows is not prey, and asked to pretend otherwise. "What do you say?" Arya asked Howland, a girl again. Properly curious. "I say," Howland answered, "may your paths be as full of small places to step as a swamp. May your enemies dislike mud. May fish always be where you need them, not where men expect them to be. May your children learn to swim before they walk. May you know the names of 3 plants that will heal, and 3 that will poison, and may you always choose the right ones." "Bensal. Good prayers," Davos said. Quiet and respectful, as if he had been in a sept. "Good luck," Howland corrected. God and luck are not enemies. They walked back in a calm that did not promise to last. Jon turned into the street of silk without thinking, and then turned back out of it when he remembered what the name promised, and that he had nothing to do there. He looked up at the hill. The dragon pit was dark now. The garlands would be withering in the cold and then falling, and the board Sansa had supplied would be lifted, and a boy would find a copper and think the gods had thought of him specifically. The weavers would take down their fabrics on the morrow and tell themselves they had seen something that would be worth unpicking someday into a tale for their grandchildren. The day a crown did not glitter and a city still cheered. The next day broke workmanlike. The crown did not make the bread rise quicker. The crown did not make the wind change its mind. Jon learned to wear it only when a man would be hurt to see him without it, or would think himself slighted. He learned how to leave it on a peg without making a ceremony of removing it. He learned to do 2 things at once: to speak to a group of merchants about the width of their carts and the width of the city's gates, and at the same time to watch a boy in the corner of the yard whose cheeks were too hollow for a winter child. He learned the names of the women who kept the ovens from cracking. Hilda and Marta and Shy Madge, who wasn't mad, but had once been shy, and now scolded men with such crisp effectiveness that soldiers turned around in the street when they heard her voice, because their bodies remembered being told to do the useful thing, rather than the dramatic one. He learned to listen to Tyrion with half an ear, and to Davos with the other half, and to Sansa with all of him. Tyrion's laws came neat and gleaming and dangerous to those who loved disorder. Davos' inventory came with notes like, "Leave off making fancy nails for a fortnight," and "Boy with gap teeth knows how to find the best wood, because he listens to trees." Sansa's lists grew vines and fruit. They began to assign shapes to departments not by choosing men with loud voices, but by choosing women who had lists, and men who could carry them without dropping them, and boys on their way to men who could be taught not to be flattered into stupidity by a silver button. A letter came from the Eyrie with the brisk hand of bronze Jan Royce. The high road could be kept clear if men were paid in salted meat and blankets, and if the tolls at the mountain gate were set at a level that made merchants feel cheated, only in ways they would tell as jokes later. Rather than grievances, a letter came from the Mander with words that tasted of river rather than grievances. A letter came from the Mander. Mud and wealth, offering grain in exchange for promises about fair price rather than gifts. A message, not a letter, arrived from the Iron Islands in the person of a woman with a scar from ear to collarbone who said, "Yara says if you want her men to fish your coasts, you'll pay them in ale and nets. And if you don't, you'll have to pay some other man more for worse fish. She prefers to deal with you because you say the thing and then do it. She says to say she sent me because I don't flirt, and she doesn't want your head turned by salt. Then, tell Yara I am faithful as a rock," John said without blinking. "Ale and nets. I will not pay more for worse fish." The woman grinned, pleased by the ease of it, and went away as if she were a tide. A man came from Old Town, not Sam, with a seal from the high tower and a smell of lavender in his cloak. He wanted to speak about glass and tithes. Sansa spoke with him in her calm voice and left him thinking he had agreed to 2 more obligations than he had brought in his pocket. And he went away with the feeling that he had been warmed, not skinned. John marveled at her. Women had kept him alive. He intended to let them keep the realm alive too. He met with the city watch on the 4th morning and chose new captains for 2 districts with firm short words. He asked them how quickly they could get from a lane near the Blackwater to the fish market, and when they said 6 minutes he told them to show him and ran with them. His cloak flapping, Davos and Brienne pounding behind, and Tyrion shouting that he would send a boy to see where they'd turned, because someone would claim they'd cheated the route. They made it in 5, because pride. He told them if they were slower next time they would walk their route each dawn until they were faster. He put an old sailor the watch had never quite forgiven for punching a gold cloak who tried to search his wife's pockets in charge of the docks, and watched the city take a deep breath because it recognized a man it could deal with. At night, when meetings folded and letters dried, John walked. He went alone sometimes, because it was useful to hear the city without men breathing every sound around him like wool. He went with Arya and listened to her tell him about knives and expressions, and the way men draw their shoulders when they mean to lie. He went with Sansa and listened to her talk to women who did not know they were talking to a queen. About flour and husbands and weather, and the way grief behaves like a house guest who never leaves but sometimes sits quietly enough to ignore. He went with Davos to the docks and watched men dice and not cheat, and saw the way Davos put his hand on a boy's head and did not bless him exactly, but left him marked with a clean brand of attention. There were moments when theater insisted on itself. He judged a quarrel between 2 minor lords who had been neighbors too long not to hate one another. He stood in the rebuilt room where the great sept had been, now open to sky, and watched as Maribald's daughter married 2 girls who had waded through a war, and then another, and had decided not to wait through a reign. He sat on a low stool in the hearth of a baker's shop, while Sansa checked the oven for cracks, and the baker's daughter told him the names of all the cats who came for heat. He bent in the godswood and brushed snow from a root, and thought of Ned Stark's hands and of another hand, thinner, with music in it. He wrote Lyanna's name once in the margin of his own ledger, and drew a line through it, because the dead do not want to be entered into books they did not ask to appear in, and because he liked the look of her name, uncontained. There were also the first stones of trouble. A cousin of a Lannister too small to be dangerous tried to become larger by boasting about debts the crown owed that no longer existed, and nearly made a riot in a square. A priest of the 7 with ambitious eyebrows declared that the gods had chosen a queen and not a king, and then refused to name her. He turned out to be angling for a position in some other court. Men who had thrived on caravan tax without providing roads found themselves asked to produce receipts and grew indignant. Sansa wrote cards with neat scripts and sent them to men with names such as these, telling them she would be pleased to see them at dawn the next day, at a table where they could make their case. When they came, she greeted them with porridge and a ledger, and the demand that they speak slowly, so that the scribe could record the exact amount of their indignation in numbers. Most of them deflated into men again, when they realized the performance would have to become arithmetic. Arya reported that a man with a scar near his ear had said the word "golden" softly in an alley, and then walked away when a woman selling oranges asked him to repeat himself. "We'll have a nest of sellsword captains somewhere in this city." She said, picking dirt from the seam of a boot. "They're not foolish enough to gather together, but they do meet in pairs. I'll find which alley has their smell." "Don't kill anyone important," Sansa said from her chair at the table. "That remains poorly defined," Arya said agreeably. "If he tries to stab me, he becomes less important." "Bring me one," Jon said. "I want to see the face of a man who thinks he can shape a realm with coin from across the sea, and a word he believes means fear." She nodded as if he had asked for bread, and the next night, she brought him a man with a scar near his ear, who had little to say and much to sweat. Jon did not ask his name. He asked who had paid him last. When the man answered, a name like a knife slipping on oiled meat, Jon put that name in his book and drew a circle around it, not to make it special but to remind himself to choose the day he would speak to that man and make of him either a citizen or a story. Letters came from the north. Meg Mormont had taken the winter town in hand and turned it to her will as a woman turns a bridle. She demanded 24 loaves to be sent by the river as an example to another town that had been sulking. Wyman's grandson had built a scaffold for drying nets and a second for drying venison, and said he would have built a third if he had more wood. The girls at Bear Island had learned to balance halberds and to scold their brothers in 3 new registers. Howland Reed's people had sent jars of pickled weeds with a note in his hand. "These will keep men alive when pride wishes to be full, but cannot be." Sansa cried over that quietly and angrily, and said she had not meant to do it, and that she blamed the pickle for smelling like their childhood when they had pretended the maid's onions were jewels. On the 7th day, Jon went to the sept that was no longer a sept and stood with Meribald's daughter on the stones where the pews had been. "Will your crown cause me trouble?" she asked frankly, not accusing and not deferential. "It is not heavier than the last crown, but the men who love crowns most are always the same weight." "It will," Jon said. "Not today, not tomorrow. Someday when we are tired and think we have earned a rest and think the crown will sit on its own, that is when it will become a problem." "And you?" "I will be a problem," Jon said. "For men who prefer theater to bread. For men who prefer fear to patience. For men who sell names and ship rumor on boats." She smiled then, unexpectedly gentle. "You answer like a man who knows he is visible to God. I like that. Not because I believe in God necessarily, but because it makes you graceful." "I was never graceful," Jon said. "Ask any man who watched me try to dance." "Dance?" Maribald's daughter lifted a narrow brow. "We will need new dances here. Nothing teaches people how to stand near one another better than that." "Teach them," Jon said. "Give me a floor that doesn't give splinters," she said without pause. "Give me 2 fiddlers and 1 man who can keep a beat by slapping a barrel with his hand. Give me a room warm enough that a woman can take off her gloves without thinking she must choose between fingers and joy." "You'll have it," Jon said. "We'll have it built for winter and keep it for summer. The greenhouse will be for those who need to see leaves. The dance house will be for those who need to remember that entertainment does not always draw blood." Nendersowl. He walked out with the sunlight in his eyes and nearly tripped over a boy running, who skidded to a stop with skin, knees, and breath like a puppy's. The boy stared up and then blurted, "I saw a wolf," in a tone of triumph that asked for correction. "You did," Jon said gravely. "He saw you as well." "What's his name?" the boy demanded. "Ghost," Jon said. "That's not a name," the boy scoffed, fierce and free. "It is to him," Jon said. And the boy nodded as if that were a satisfyingly mysterious thing and ran off to tell the first person whose face looked game for astonishment. The days stacked, each brick with mortar. There were petitions and there were bowls of stew. and there were nights when John's shoulder ached from hammering and mornings when his head ached from names. There were the first letters back from places he had written to, and then the work of answering those letters in tones that measured hope and restraint, precisely as a baker measures salt. There were men who came to tell him he was wrong about something, and were surprised to discover that he liked that part, because it meant the thing could be made righter. A raven came from the wall with a hand he did not recognize. Brothers with names are fewer than brothers with scars. We need axes, and we need boys who do not think themselves too fine to carry dung out of the byres. We will take widowers and widows if you will have us take them. We will take girls who can keep watch without gossiping. We will take anyone who wishes a quiet place to do useful work. Send what you can, and send a story that will make boys in the South want to come north and be cold. John wrote back, I will send you men who have learned they are not made for killing and women who are better at listening for wind. I will send you boys who believe they are unseen and ask you to teach them that the most honorable thing in the world is to be unseen doing the necessary work. I will send you girls who have been told they are not strong and ask you to show them what strength looks like when it wakes up before dawn and doesn't talk about itself. He sealed it with the wolf and the dragon, and sent it with a bird that took the air like a knife cutting cloth. There were nights when he woke with his heart beating as if he had run a hill, and he had not. He would lie in the dark and listen to Sansa breathing in the next room, and to the scratch of a mouse and to ghosts' dream woofs, and think of the way the crown had felt in the bowl with leaves floating, and the sound the water had made. He would think of Ned Stark's hand on his shoulder, and of Lyanna's name in a book he had not been meant to read, and of Rhaegar's music, and of his father's silence, and know that none of that had prepared him for measuring out flour to the bakers, or for telling a girl who had lost a finger that she could still sew well enough to be paid as much as any woman who had two. He was not alone, and it was good that he was not. Census lists took up a table, then two wide. Davos ledgers occupied a bench that had been made for a different sort of courtier. Arius reports, when she bothered to make them, came in the form of knives set down exactly where John's hand would go, if he were a different man, and reached without looking. Tyrion's laws took shape with a neatness that disguised their teeth, and then showed their compassion if you read the subclauses. Howland Reed came and went like weather, and when he stayed he sat quietly, and was content to teach a boy to plait rushes, and a girl to spin a length of line that would not break when wet. When the first panes of glass arrived, wrapped in straw and in the worry of men who had carried them, the carpenter stood with his hands on his hips and said, I'll put them in as if I were laying my child down, and did so, breath held, with a tenderness that made the boys at the forge quiet. The greenhouse took shape like a ship's hull turned inward. Rib, 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 the empty spaces promises. The day the last pane sat in its bed, and the carpenter closed his eyes and did not touch it, in case blessing by palm were a curse, Sansa stood inside and felt the air. We can coax lettuce, she said, and the children can bring their hands in here on days their fingers are too cold to feel they belong to them. A woman from Dorne who knew something about oranges and sands, and how to trick a plant into believing a season, lay down in front of it, came and ran her hands along the wood. You will need to learn to let the hot out sometimes, she said. Heat can kill as surely as ice. We will open a window, Sansa said. We will not suffocate our green. Good, the woman said, and took off her shoes and flexed her toes on the warm boards in pleasure. John brought a handful of seeds that had been kept in a jar north, where they had been meant for a spring that had not come, and gave them to a boy to press into soil. The boy did not cry exactly. He breathed hard and set the seeds down as if they were birds he had captured and meant to feed until they flew. In the dance house Maribald's daughter had demanded, the first night's music was uneven and happy. Men who had never allowed themselves to look foolish were shown, gently, how to let their knees soften without falling. Women who had steeled themselves into usefulness let their shoulders drop and discovered they could be useful with a different set of muscles. A boy who had lost his mother to fever learned that he could be held by strangers and not break. John stood in the doorway and listened to the beat on the barrel, and felt something in him align, not with power but with the way community sounds when it is practicing. He did not dance. Not yet. He had other work. He sent letters to the Riverlands asking about bridges that had fallen and whether they were worth raising. He asked the Vale to share masons and promised grain in return. He asked the Reach to send boys who knew irrigation and told them he would send back men who had learned to keep books on water. He wrote to White Harbor asking for ships that could carry timber and fish both, and promised to send men with axes and patience to the forests that still stood. He wrote to Sunspear and asked to borrow a man who knew how to build a market where women would not be trampled. And Arianne wrote back, "I will come myself, and bring 3 old women who will teach you to keep men where they belong when they are hungry and think themselves clever." He wrote to the Iron Islands asking for nets, and to the Wall again, asking for stories to send south to boys who did not yet know they could be proud of work no one clapped for. And in the quiet where no letters could enter, because he had blown the candle out and decided to leave one thing undone until morning like a normal man, he allowed himself to think of Daenerys, not as a queen in a legend, but as a woman he had loved, and let the ache be a clean ache rather than a festering one. He did not speak her name. He did not need to. Ghost stirred and laid his head on Joan's chest and made a noise that wolves make when they are content with the arrangement of bodies in their pack. On the 10th day, a small riot began at the fish market and ended before it had teeth. Not because men had suddenly become wise, but because the protocols had been set. 2 women with peels, a watch patrol looking bored, a baker with a loud voice, and a list of names of boys who were to cut the loaves and hand them out. A man who had once been a sellsword took a boy's knife from his hand and began to demonstrate how to cut the slices evenly to keep a fight from starting. Arya watched from a roof. She saw the moment that could have turned and did not. She dropped a copper into the hat of a musician who had begun to play something light with cold fingers, and then flitted away across the rooftops toward a smell of oranges. On the 11th morning, Jon found himself on the road to the guild hall, because a guild of coopers had taken it upon themselves to demand that barrels be taxed by the hoop, not by the stave, which would have been a disaster had anyone else had the patience to notice. He brought 2 barrels into the courtyard and took them apart with a mallet and a knife until there were staves and hoops. He counted the staves, he counted the hoops, and he counted the time it took 3 men to rebuild them. Then he taxed the barrels by the man-hour. The coopers were furious until they realized it would pay well when they became more efficient. Tyrion clapped from a window. "You must stop being sensible," he called. "It makes us look weak." "Be my guest," Jon called back. "Write something foolish and put your name to it. I'll sell copies in the market." "Then?" Tyrion bowed extravagantly and sent down a boy with a roll of paper for Jon anyway. The law about bread had been written. It was spare. It stated that bread could not be withheld from the hungry if there was bread within a certain number of steps from where a hungry man lay, and if the baker's house had received wood from the city in the last 9 days. It set penalties that could be paid in grain instead of coin. It allowed for exceptions to be written in the book called Mercy at a baker's request, if she could show that giving would mean her children starve. It was sane. Jon read it and thought, with an uncomfortable tenderness he would not have admitted aloud, that Tyrion had learned something beyond dexterous words. He set the law's seal, and Sansa arranged to have it copied in a hand, large enough for market walls, and forward enough for men who could not read to have it read to them. It was a small law. It felt large. A man who tried to cheat it the next day found himself on the wrong side of a crowd's patience, and was saved by a watchman who dragged him out and set him to work carrying sacks until his mouth learned to be too tired for argue. A raven came from the Riverlands with a ribbon of blue tied to its leg. It carried a letter from a woman who had made herself a leader because she had stood up to a band of hungry men when no one else had, and then had not stopped standing. She wrote, "We have bread that can be spared if you will spare us a millstone. The winter took the last one, and the river will take the next, if we don't move it." Jon sent a mason. Davos sent rope. Sansa sent a letter to a man who could read the river's moods like his wife's. The 3 together made a millstone spin. Jon added a line in Mercy. A millstone saved is bread multiplied. And because the realm must have theater as well as bread, the second formal audience of the reign was set. Ambassadors properly dressed from places that preferred to believe they wore gowns of influence rather than cloaks of need. The Bravos factor stood with blank face, and individuals from Lys and Myr and Pentos performed their courtesies with varying degrees of sincerity. A man from Korth brought spices and theatrical jackets and spoke in sentences that ended in their own reflections. Jon tasted a spice he could not name and promised to think about trade in spring, and then put the thought aside and asked the man from Pentos whether he knew a glassblower who could teach the greenhouse to breathe without breaking. The man brightened. A problem solved could become a profit, earned more reliably than a promise. After the ambassadors left, Sansa laughed and put her head briefly against Jon's shoulder, the way she might have done when a jest had landed in the Great Hall, in a winter when their father lived. "We have survived pageantry without anyone being tempted to set fire to anything," she said. "Let's keep that a tradition," Jon said. They ate soup that night in the long house among men whose names would never be written into anyone's psalms, and among women whose names were written into Sansa's lists, and therefore, Jon suspected, into God's. Arya appeared with a smear of flour on her nose and stole a slice of onion from his bowl, and then disappeared with a wave that might have been a salute if she had cared for such things. Davos told a story about a storm that had broken 3 decks in a night, and the boy who had kept his head by singing under his breath, and how both of them had lived. When Jon rose to go to his pallet, Tyrion touched his sleeve. "There will be a challenge," he said quietly, so that the others would continue their talk and not notice the way his voice had changed key. "Not the petty ones. A proper one. A man with money and friends. 3 men with swords and no patience. A woman with a claim in her mouth and an army who thinks it would like to march again because marching feels like purpose. I will not be able to talk through all of it. You will have to decide when to be stone and when to be water." "Then?" "I know," Jon said. He did not ask what shape the trouble would take. He did not need to. Men were inventive, but not so inventive they could surprise him beyond the forms trouble always loves. He told Ghost, who blinked at him as if to say that wolves met trouble with teeth and rest, and that men should learn a thing so simple. He slept as if he believed he could. In his dream the road widened again, not because he asked it to, but because other feet came onto it, and the wolf and the dragon moved at the pace of a man beside them, not above and not ahead. He woke with the taste of cold apple on his tongue, and the feel of winter steel warm in his palm, and the knowledge that the next days would be work, not battle, and that this was the highest grace a winter king could ask. There would be a man. There would be a claim. There would be a sword and a speech and a woman who came with maps and loved them too much. There would be the river and the glass and the bread and the book called Mercy. He rose. He dressed. He took up the crown briefly to remind his hair it had something to support. He set it back on the peg. He went to count wood. He went to count loaves. He went to make a law. Outside, the city breathed in cold air, made of it a fog, and breathed it out as warmth. A wolf trotted along the shadow of a wall. A king folded his sleeves and put his hands into the work that had waited for him since men first decided they would be governed by someone, and not by their own appetites. A work which felt very much like the work of a steward of a great house called the world.